Hello and welcome to the Digital Rabbi podcast. I'm here with the awesome Matt Rosenberg, Rabbi Matt Rosenberg, I should say. I'm tuning in all the way from Seattle over across the big pond. So, hey Matt, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I mean, we were talking just a little bit before and I came across you, I think on Josh and Kelsey's podcast, who's also part of C3. I'm involved in C3 as well. And I have to say, Matt, your conversation with Josh just opened up a whole thing that I feel like firstly, it's been hugely transformational for me, but I feel like it's just such a helpful topic for church leaders, for people involved in ministry. Tell us a little bit about you, Matt. Just give us a little picture, a little introduction. Yeah.
Okay. I'm married to Laura for 20 years this June. We have 3 kids. They are 11, 14, and 16. I lead a congregation called Restoration in Seattle, Washington. And I'm one of 4 Messianic rabbis in my family. So my dad and my uncle are both Messianic rabbis in New York and New Jersey. My older brother is a Messianic rabbi near Chicago. And then I'm here in Seattle. So I grew up Messianic, meaning we're Jews that follow Jesus. My parents started their congregation when I was 10. And I've just always, and we were part of Messianic congregations in Philly and New Jersey and New York before they started their congregations. So my parents were hippies that ran away together, got saved during the Jesus movement in the U.S. My dad's Jewish. My mom is Italian, raised Roman Catholic. And so my older brother and I were both born in Oregon because that's where good hippies in the U.S. went, from New Jersey to Oregon. And when I was about 5 weeks old, we moved to the East Coast, to Philadelphia, to join one of the first Messianic congregations in the country. And then that's the short story.
That's awesome. Well, let's get right into it, because I feel like there would be people listening right now who don't know what a Messianic congregation is. It sounds, at least in my context, that's an unusual kind of array of words. So just help us understand what's going on there, and really dumb it down for us as well.
Okay. Yeah, so I am a Jewish person, in all parts of Judaism, streams of Judaism these days. You're Jewish if you have one parent or grandparent who's Jewish. Okay. And Judaism is a little bit of an anomaly in the world because it is both a religion and an ethnicity. And so, people aren't born Christian or Buddhist or Muslim, but you are born Jewish.
Yes.
So it stands out in that sense. And to the point now where there are Jewish atheists, which is kind of a funny term since God founded the Jewish people when he made a covenant with Abraham. So we are Jewish people who, I consider myself Torah observant, meaning I observe the commandments in the first 5 books of the Bible. But we observe them differently than like Orthodox Judaism would, because they have a whole bunch of added rules that they consider Torah that we don't. And then we have, in one sense, added rules from our rabbi, Jesus, in the New Testament, that are part of following God. So God made he only made covenants with the Jewish people, including the New Covenant. And part of that covenant is for us to be faithful to the things that he commanded us to do. So we keep the Sabbath. So our services are on Saturday morning. I don't eat pork or shellfish. I do eat cheeseburgers because Abraham served cheeseburgers to God in Genesis 18. And we keep the feasts. Yeah, we keep the feasts in that we're commanded to keep in the Torah, and we circumcise our sons on the 8th day. But we also follow Jesus, who people say, Jesus was Jewish, but the truth is he's still currently Jewish. And wow. If you want to be graphic about it, which I don't mind being, if his resurrection was bodily, that means sitting at the right hand of the Father, he's still circumcised. And wow. was circumcised on the 8th day according to the covenants, and is in his body. He is the fullness of, he's the embodiment of the Jewish people in a human being who is also God. Yes. So ultimately, he's my rabbi, he's our rabbi, and we want to be faithful to the things that he's asked us to do. Yeah,
that's awesome. I love it. So many questions coming your way right now.
Yeah. So the struggle for most Christians is they've been told that when you believe in Jesus, that he somehow put an end to the law. And so it confuses people when I say I'm Torah observant, because aren't those things done away with is the first question. The simple answer is they're not done away with for Jewish people, and they were never required of Gentiles.
Right.
But that's a whole paradigm shift for lots of people.
Yeah, that is huge. And I think, depending on context, many people might not know any Jewish people. So it's so easy when you're reading the scripture, particularly if nobody ever mentions that we all know Jesus was a Jew. But I think it's the idea that Jesus is not just a Jew, but he is a Jew, and he still is Jewish. That is something that you struggle with a little bit, because in your mind, you will have a picture. I don't know if I have like a painted picture in my mind, but there is a sense of who Jesus is, right? As you're communing with him, prayer and all of that. And the idea that he is Jewish that's something I've had to, that doesn't come easily. That's like a new thing that is like, wow, I need to incorporate that into who I believe Jesus is, because nobody's talking about that. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we've got to this point, I guess, in Western civilization where we have kind of lost some of the context and the roots of what Christianity is?
Well, it starts really early. There's a church father named Justin Martyr who, in about 135, which is only, John is the last apostle to die in 95. So there's not many years from 95 to 135. Justin Martyr is like a disciple of the disciples, maybe a disciple of the disciples of the disciples. He's like second or third generation from the actual first disciples. And he wrote this thing called the Dialogue with Trypho. And Trypho is a Jewish guy that he creates. And most of the kind of the oldest anti-Semitisms come from that dialogue.
Wow.
And, all the way to Martin Luther in the 1500s, the last 2 years of his life, he wrote a 65,000 word pamphlet called Against the Jews and Their Lies.
Wow.
And kind of everywhere in between, you have Constantine and like all these different
Yeah.
people who loved Jesus but didn't understand the Jewish people and had no relationship to them. And it's the opposite of, the question for the original disciples in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council is, how can a Gentile follow Jesus? To us now in 2022, and the question is, how can a Jewish person follow Jesus? So there's kind of like this, it flips upside down. And I think the disciples had no concept in their minds that people would ever separate following Jesus from Jewish faith. So because of all these different parts of history, and Christianity became a different religion from Judaism. And so much so that over the years, Jewish people had to reject the practice of Judaism in order to follow Jesus. So, I mean, there's a lot of, you can go real deep on, and pretty far back into the early days following the resurrection and how quickly it shifts, which in part is because, the most the Jewish people have ever been, at least recorded, is right before the Holocaust in 1938. We were like 16.4 million Jewish people, which in a planet of 7 billion is it's a small minority. So once Gentiles started to accept Jesus through the preaching of Paul specifically, we were quickly outnumbered. And I think in part just because of the math, it became, faith became dominated by non-Jewish people that had no connection to Jewish thought or Jewish understanding. And a lot of the things that are said by Christians about Judaism, especially in the first century, they're just not true. It's the difference between book knowledge, you read a book about something and make a decision, or you experience it in real life. And most Christians have book knowledge about Judaism, but have no interaction with actual Jewish faith. So, and then it creates a lot of confusion. And then the problem is throughout, just aside from the Bible and general culture of the world we live in, believing in Jesus means you're not Jewish. Right. Because you're now a Christian. And kind of modern Messianic Judaism is trying to put that in its proper context that the disciples would have understood, which is the most Jewish thing anyone can do is believe in Jesus because he's our Messiah before he's anybody else's.
Right. He's the ultimate fulfillment of, So, wow. Yeah. Okay. So, what amazes me is how quickly, you gave the dates there from John to Justin, wasn't it? How quickly that change comes into the church. And it always amazes me how God allows the church, but even throughout the whole biblical narrative, the thing to get so messed up along the way. What does it look like because obviously God has a plan and all of that jazz, and there is a purpose. Where are we going? What's the direction? How will God restore that to the church at large and to the body of Christ and all of that?
Yeah, well, I think that's what God is doing right now in history, is bringing Jewish context, historical context, back into our minds. And David Stern is one of my heroes. I know you're reading his commentary, the Jewish New Testament commentary.
It's amazing.
And he wrote a book called Restoring the Jewishness of the Gospel. And one of his statements which he wrote that book in 1988. And one of the statements is, everyone believes that they're preaching the full gospel. But you can't preach the gospel in its fullness without the Jewishness of Jesus.
Wow.
Simply because if you go, if you meet a person like, you and I are, what's the first thing you ask somebody when you begin a relationship is, tell me about yourself. And Jesus's Jewishness, his practice of Judaism, is a major component of his life and what he did when he was on earth. And so in having a relationship with him, like I say to people all the time, it's as simple as, if for some reason, at least in the United States, people often eat ham on Easter. In most of the rest of the world, everybody still eats lamb, which is the connection to Passover. So I say to people here in the States, if you had Jesus over for Easter, he wouldn't eat the ham, and he wouldn't be mad. He wouldn't be mad at you for eating it either, but he would just pass the plate to something he could eat, because it's, if Jesus didn't keep all of the commandments that he's required to keep, then he wouldn't be sinless. So people say things like Jesus broke the Sabbath, because it says in John chapter 5 that the Pharisees were upset at him because he equated himself with God and broke the Sabbath. I remember I went to a Christian college, and my professor came in and said to class and said, Jesus broke the Sabbath. And I was like 18 years old, and I raised my hand and I said, he definitely did not. And he said, why would you say that? I said, because if Jesus broke the Sabbath, then he's not sinless. He broke the extra rules for the Sabbath that he never commanded, but he wouldn't break anything that he commanded his people to do. One, because he's a part of the people, and two, because he's the one who gave us the commandments in the first place. So breaking them doesn't prove anything. It's actually keeping the commandments is what proves that he is who he said he is. But that, because most Christians have no concept of Sabbath or what the Sabbath is actually like, and what the keeping of the Sabbath is, and what keeping kosher is for, and they just assume, well, he broke it to prove that we are free from it. But the funny thing about that logic is Gentiles were never required to keep those things ever.
Right. Yes.
So he doesn't have to, like my same professor came in to class one time and said he didn't have his son circumcised to prove he was free from the law. And I raised my hand again and I said, why would you try to prove that you were free from something you were never under?
Yes.
And as a Jewish person, I would never try to be free of those things. Yeah. Like the circumcision of my son was one of the greatest days of my life, because he had no choice in being entered into the covenant. Now, he can choose to not follow the covenant as he gets older, but he didn't have a choice at birth. And it was my responsibility to have him circumcised, because the spilling of blood is a part of the sign of the covenant that God made with Abraham and told us as his descendants to keep forever. So if he shows up and says, I know I said forever, but I didn't actually mean forever, because what I meant was I was going to come and change everything to something totally different. The Torah tells us not to listen to him to a person like that. It literally says in it literally says in Deuteronomy 18, and this is kind of the, I think big idea of my book, and it says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst." This is Moses speaking. "From your brothers, Jewish, to him you must listen. This is just what you asked of the Lord your God on the day of the assembly, when you said, I cannot continue to hear the voice of God or see this great fire anymore, or I will die. So the Lord said, they have done well with what they have spoken. I'll raise up a prophet for you, like you, for them from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak them all that I command him. Now whoever does not listen to my words that this prophet speak, I myself will call him to account. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet will die."
Wow.
So if Jesus shows up and says, everything God promised the Jewish people was just a means to an end, and all of that is done now because I'm going to die, and I'm starting something totally brand new, we have an obligation to not follow him and to kill him. Now, he was put to death, and people argue all the time. Did the Jews put Jesus to death? Did the Romans put Jesus to death? But the Gospels are clear that he offered himself as a sacrifice because he had to die. But, in several places throughout the Torah, the idea that Jesus does something new that's outside of the boundaries of Jewish faith to start something totally brand new is what we're supposed to run away from.
Yes.
So what he actually did, and this is the book that I wrote is called Jesus Never Said Anything New for that reason, is because everything he said and taught and did was in the context of Judaism in the first century, or we call it Second Temple Judaism. The thing that was different about Jesus was not his content, but it was the authority with which he spoke.
Yes.
So rabbis still say, when you read through the Talmud and you read in Jewish thought, right? Judaism is very comfortable with disagreement.
Sure.
Like two rabbis can say the opposite thing and they're probably both right. which is really foreign for most Christians, because if you're an Orthodox Christian, it means this plus this equals Orthodox faith. But in Judaism, it's like this plus this, but also could minus or divide or multiply. I don't know. We can all kind of make it. It's just a totally different. So Jesus walks into conversations in the Gospels. The Pharisees are not his enemies. They're his brothers. And if we're honest about what's happening in the text, if the Pharisees are the leaders of the Jewish people, which they were, then Jesus is the one that gave them authority to lead the Jewish people because he's the God of Abraham. So when he corrects them, he's not correcting them because he's removing all authority. He's correcting them because their hearts aren't in the right place and they're not doing the right thing. Just like all the prophets in the Old Testament show up and say, you're not doing what God told you to do. And the people say, yes, we are. And then they say, no, you're not. Right? So they have all these questions for him. And his answer is often, well, let me just tell you what I meant when I wrote it and gave it to Moses.
Yes.
Which is...
That's huge.
Who are you saying you are? Like that's... So the content, and people ask me all the time, which is a perfectly logical question. Didn't Jesus say, I give you a new commandment? And didn't he say, like, you've heard it said, but as for me? But what's the new commandment he gives? This new commandment I give is to love one another as I have loved you. Those exact words are found when God gives the Torah to Moses in Exodus. Like, exactly. We're to love God as he loves us. That's always been true. So why does he say new? And I think in context, when you find out something that you didn't know, or something you knew and you forgot,
Yes.
it feels brand new. But it's not. And when you go down the list of the things when he says, you have heard it said, but I say, several of them aren't even from the Torah at all. They're just statements like, you have heard it said, love your enemy, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But hate your enemy is not in the Torah.
Right.
So, but people read it as it is, right? So, what's new about Jesus is the authority with which he speaks, not the content of what he's teaching. And, that simple idea I've found changes the way people read the New Testament, or at least the way we were taught to read it, which is flawed, because it's minus context.
Yeah. I mean, this is just humongous. Like I've said it already, but that single thought truly has. I think it's just a whole new lens, which is, as you said, context. I mean, one question I've got for you, Matt, is just around Bible translations. I mean, I know obviously there's plenty of translations out there. What's a better way for us to read? Because as I've been reading some of the commentary, I'm realizing certain things, okay, that's not quite how it's presented. And of course, nothing's perfect unless you can speak the original language, right? But for us lowly English speakers who don't tend to speak any other languages, is there anything we can do? We spoke about David Stern's commentary, which I think has been just an amazing resource. What are some other ways that we can get back to the context?
I mean, the thing that's amazing about the time that we live in is you don't really need to learn Hebrew and Greek and be proficient in them to find the information about the Hebrew and the Greek. There's so many resources for simple word studies that both Jewish and Christian that change context. For instance, the word in the King James was translated in 1611 and is the first English translation. So they chose certain words in their translation, like they used the word soul, but the words in Hebrew and Greek don't always mean, like, soul's not the only meaning.
Right.
And in fact, you go back into Hebrew, you find that the word for soul is the word nephesh, and nephesh actually means throat. And the reason why it means throat is because the throat is where everything goes into your body.
Wow.
So if you think about, like, simply love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength.
Gosh.
But all three of those to ancient Israel are not what those words mean to us in English. So,
Okay.
for instance, the word heart, which sometimes is actually, the Hebrew translation is actually kidneys, not heart. But the belief in the ancient Israel is that the kidneys or the heart, everything they say about the kidneys or the heart is what we understand to be the mind. So it was the seat
Okay.
of
Yeah.
emotion. It was the seat of like decision making. It was so everything that when they say heart, they mean brain. When they
Sure.
say when the English says soul, the word in Hebrew is nephesh, which actually more is better translated as body,
Mm.
right?
Well, that
Because
is very confusing.
it is. Because the idea that the soul leaves the body at death is actually Plato. It's not the Bible.
Mm.
And Plato has this
Sure.
effect on both Christianity and Judaism, where somehow it becomes a soul or a spirit leaves your body. But actually, your body, you're still in your body when we see the Lord. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, is actually to mean your body is actually what stands before God. So, heart is brain, soul is body, and strength actually is just the word mayod, which means very. So, Tim Mackey, Tim Mackey from the Bible Project translates it as muchness. It's like it's
Sure.
like
Wow.
if you have your brain and your body, then the strength is everything else. So
Wow.
it's actually love the Lord your God with all of your brain, with all of your body, and with everything else that you have.
Gosh.
So
So which Bible translation says that?
none of them. None of them. But actually, the Bible Project has these amazing videos on the Shema, which is where that comes from. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength.
Sure.
And they break down each of those words in like 5-minute videos.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating. So I say that to, the translation doesn't have to be exact in English for us to understand as much as the work
Sure.
that we do to understand context.
That's it. Yeah.
So you have to understand how the original hearers, the ones speaking and the ones hearing, what they would have understood in their time and their culture. And then how does that
Yes.
apply to how we understand those same things? They didn't have the science that we have to understand the brain and psychology and decision making, and it doesn't mean it wasn't there. They just
Yes.
used a different word to explain those same things.
Sure.
So if we understand that context, then I want to give the Lord all of my mind and all of my body and everything else that's
Yeah.
within me. So, and then, this is part of the problem with the Bible is you have like 1,000 years, 1,500 years between Abraham and John. So that's part of like just in their own, God speaks. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever.
Right.
But nothing else is. So when he spoke through Moses, he said it in a way they would understand it. When he spoke through
Yes.
the disciples, he spoke in a way that they would understand it. And we have to try the best we can to
Yeah.
dig into context to understand what
Wow.
they would have understood.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And do you think there is a growing hunger, or I'd love to hear what you think. Do you think just as I, in the last year or so, have been really trying to explore and understand. Do you think there's a rising sort of desire to see that in the Western Church?
Yeah, I mean, I love the whole deconstruction of evangelicism.
Sure. Okay.
You know, I don't love when people turn away from faith altogether.
Of course.
But I think what people are genuinely trying to deconstruct are the things that don't make any sense and don't seem to fit reality.
Yes.
And I think that deconstruction is leading people to go older and deeper than, you know, I mean, American evangelicism is as old as America, which in the grand scheme of things is not old by anybody's definition. There are good things in it, but there are also things that miss the mark. And we have to be willing to re-examine those things. And that's true for, I mean, it's not just true for American evangelicism, it's true for every system.
Yeah.
Because we end up falling in love with our systems more than the truth they're meant to express.
Yeah.
And, you know, we kind of all have to break down why we do what we do and where is it actually coming from, not just if your answer to why I do something is because that's the way it's always been done. Number one, it's not true. It hasn't always been done that way.
Yes.
And number two, I think God is constantly trying to shake up the things that make us most comfortable.
Yeah. And I suppose, ironically, that would be, you know, the kind of temptation to go throughout the Old Testament and kind of, you know, just oh, that was then and this is now. It's kind of the same sort of thing, isn't it? It's funny how that's kind of the opposite of, you know, oh, this is just the way it's always been. Yeah.
No, totally. I mean, you think about it this way. When Jesus shows up, there's 1,500 years between him and Moses. So we had been waiting for the Messiah, like the words I just read from Deuteronomy 18. We've been waiting for that for almost as long, for not much longer than we've been waiting for him to come back.
Right.
There's 2,000 years between us and Jesus, but there's 1,500 years between him and Moses.
Wow.
And so people were surprised because by what he said and what he did, because there's 1,500 years of making stuff up.
Right. Sure.
Right. I had a guy from Jews for Jesus said in a class one time in college, he came in as a guest speaker and he said, somebody asked him about eschatology and the end times. And he said, you know, I just think that people are going to be just as surprised at how he comes back the second time as we were the first time he came.
Right.
Because there's going to be whole groups of people who are like, he's going to show up and we're going to go, that's not how you're supposed to show up.
Right.
And he's going to say, according to who? Well, Karl Barth said, Martin Luther said, John Calvin said, Chrysostom said, you know, like everybody has their people. And it's like, well, I mean, this is what that guy said. And Jesus is going to say, oh yeah, I love that guy. He's with me. But he was wrong about that part. And we're going to be like, well, what do we do now? And he'll do exactly what he did the first time, which is, oh, just follow me. It'll be okay.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, man, that's wild.
But whole groups of people who say they follow Jesus are going to deny him when he shows up because he's not going to show up the way they expected him to. Meanwhile, we're mad at the Pharisees and the Sadducees because how could they miss it? And the answer is because we're human beings, and
Wow.
we all miss it. So stop missing it.
Wow.
So I don't think Jewish context, is the answer to everything.
Of course.
But I do think it's something God is doing in this generation, and it really goes back to the end of World War II, and you have guys like Karl Barth and Bonhoeffer, and the Nazis. I mean, nobody who is a Christian would say that the Nazis were Christians, but the problem is there's all kinds of things mixed up with Jesus and the Nazis. For instance, when they there's a book, Man's Search for Meaning. Can't remember his name.
Okay.
It'll come to me in a second. But he survived the Holocaust, was a psychologist. And in his telling in his book, when they got off the train, the doors open of the train in Auschwitz, the concentration camp, there was a big sign in German that said, "You killed Christ, so we kill you."
Gosh.
Like, so many things wrong with that.
Wow.
But there's all this entanglement that Christian scholars, as a result of the Holocaust and the murder of a third of the Jewish people in the name of Christ, made real Christians and theologians start to go back and say, maybe we missed. This isn't Christianity. We know it's not Christianity. But there's something in our theology that got us to this point.
Right. Wow.
So we have to fix it. So in the 40s, early 40s, people start, Christian theologians start writing about the Jewishness of Jesus. There's a whole new perspective on Paul that is birthed out of that, which sees Paul as a rabbi who was always a rabbi and didn't leave Judaism.
Right.
And then in the 60s, even, the birth of the State of Israel is in 1948. And all of that contributes to a Jewish homeland, fulfillment of God's promise that he would bring us back to the land.
Yeah.
And then Christians trying to wrestle with that. What does that really mean for us? And then modern Messianic Judaism is really, it really starts in the late 1800s, actually, in England, where there are Christians who were Jewish, had Jewish background, and started calling themselves Hebrew Christians.
Right.
And they were mostly scholars, like Hebrew scholars, theologians. And during the Jesus movement in the 60s, a whole bunch of Jewish people got saved. And they all kind of in different pockets all over the world, London being one of them, New York, Dallas, Chicago, LA. Kind of Jewish people who were coming to Jesus started all asking the same question. If Jesus is Jewish and the disciples are Jewish, aren't we still Jewish? And what happened, like when my dad was young, everybody on every side told him he couldn't do what he was doing. His Jewish family was saying, if you believe in Jesus, you're a Christian, you're not Jewish anymore. And the people who led him to the Lord said the same thing. Well, you're not Jewish anymore because you're Christian now.
Gosh,
and they kind of, his whole generation was like, I don't think that's right. But everybody thinks we're wrong. And what's happening now, I'll be 43 in April. And what I've found probably in the last 10 years is I keep running into pastors and Christians that are already like, oh no, that totally makes sense that Jews would follow Jesus and remain Jews. So there's like this long-term, I don't know, I feel like it's been happening much longer than we realize. Something God's been kind of prepping his people for, that I think there is more of an openness now than there ever has been. And the deconstruction movement is funny to me because all these people in the deconstruction movement are going to older, right? They're going to Anglican or to like Catholicism or to Eastern Orthodox. And it's like, I mean, if you want old, just go back to the source. Which you can't become Jewish. Like I don't think conversion works either way. But you know, there's all kinds of things in all of those traditions that are man-made. The same is true in Judaism. There are things that are man-made, and there are things that are actually from God, and we're confused as to which is from God and which is from man. Yeah. Which is really what Jesus gets mad about. That's the only thing he gets mad about in the Gospels.
Yeah. Wow.
He gets mad not because people are keeping the Torah. He gets mad because they're calling the things they made up Torah. And they're telling people that you have to do what I am doing because that's what God said. But God didn't say it.
Right.
Huge. And I think in all of our traditions, whatever tradition people come from, we all have things we think are have-tos, but God's list of have-tos is really short in comparison to ours.
Yeah, sure.
And I think that's true in every tradition.
Yeah.
Wow. What are the things that we do that are actually commanded by God, and what are the things that we do because our mothers told us we had to, or a theologian told us we had to, or a denomination told us we had to? I think God's have-tos are really quite short.
Yeah. That's good to know.
Yeah.
It's easy to remember.
Yeah, right? Yeah, wow. Well, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus was asked. These are not new answers, by the way.
Yes.
He answers with Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4 and Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18. Both in the Torah. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. And the second is just as important as the first, love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
And then he says the part that most people don't quote in Matthew 22, verse 40, is on these two hang all the law and the prophets.
Yeah.
So what does he mean? Well, every commandment in the Torah falls under love God or love your neighbor. That's it.
Gosh, huge.
So,
huge.
And this is actually really cool. I'd have to draw it to explain it to you. But this is actually the breakdown of the 10 Commandments, by the way.
Okay.
So we know from the scriptures that God gave Moses 2 tablets. So by tradition, there's 5 on each tablet. Okay. The scriptures don't say that, right? It doesn't say how the commandments are broken up. It just says he gave Moses 2 tablets. But if you look at the 2 tablets, it's 5 and 5. The first 4 are about loving God. The other 6 are about loving your neighbor. The thing that's crazy is honor your father and mother is the 5th commandment. So it's on the first tablet, not the second, according to tradition.
Right.
But what's interesting about honor your father and mother is it goes both ways. Your father and mother are where you get an understanding of God.
Mm-hmm.
And they're also the first human beings that you interact with.
Wow.
So the fifth commandment is kind of the dividing line. It blends between the first four and the other five, because you understand God through your parents and you understand how to relate to people through your parents.
Yeah.
So when you break down the two tablets in Jewish tradition, which goes further back than Jesus, has always been understood as the first tablet is love the Lord your God. The second tablet is love your neighbor as yourself. So why don't we murder, and why don't we commit adultery? Why don't we steal? Well, because those all affect our neighbor. We're supposed to love our neighbors. But why do we keep the Sabbath, and why do we not carry the Lord's name in vain? And why do we not make graven images? Well, because we love God. It's a simple breakdown of the commandments. So when Jesus says it, and it's amazing because if you look in the context of the Gospels, right, nobody stops and goes, "Hey, that's not true," because they already know that's true.
Right. Yeah.
There's one time where he actually asks the question to a Torah lawyer, and he says, "What's the greatest commandment?" And he answers exactly the same way Jesus says it later, which is, well, everybody knows the two greatest commandments are love God and love your neighbor. And then he says, right, so just go and do that. Like it's already in the context of first century Judaism. It's not new. They were like, yeah, right, that's what our rabbis already taught us. And he's like, yeah, but sometimes they don't actually do it. So don't just, you should do what they say, but don't do what they do, because they're all human beings and they don't do what's right anyway.
Sure. Yeah, wow.
And then it's like, well, who are you? Oh, well, I am. And they're like, what do you mean? He's like, I mean, I'm different because, I'm God. And they go to stone him because that's the right response. If somebody stands in front of you and tells you they're God, I had a guy show up one time in my service who was a tall African-American guy. He was in white Jordans and white pants and a white button-down shirt, and he had a white blanket tied around his neck that went all the way down to his ankles. And he came and sat next to me in the front row, and he said, "I'd like to speak to you privately after the service." And I was like, okay. So I preached, and then he said, "Can we speak privately?" And I said, "I don't really speak with people privately on Shabbat," which isn't true. I just said that. And I said, "But I'd be happy to buy you a cup of coffee on Monday and hear your story, and we can talk." And he said, "Oh, no, I have to kick the dust off my feet." And I thought, that's a weird thing to say. So I realized later that night, I think I got an email from this guy. So I went back and looked at my email, and sure enough, I got an email that said, "I'm coming to the service today. I'd like to speak to you privately." So I emailed him back and said, "Are you the guy that I talked to? I'd love to buy you coffee on Monday and we could, sit down and talk." And his response to my email was, "I am he, period." Then he said, "You rejected me, so I have to kick the dust off my feet and move on to the next town."
Wow.
So what do you think my reaction to that email was? I'll tell you what it wasn't.
Some stolen.
I did not respond with, "That's really interesting. I'd love to hear more." I told my ushers that if this guy shows up again, to escort him out of the building. And then we're like, how could the Pharisees not listen? I mean, on a human level, somebody standing in front of you telling you they're God, you're not going to be like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Gosh, well, Matt, this has been so good. So thanks for your time. You've been very generous with your time. I'm probably going to draw this to close, but I just want to give you one last question. Just maybe we'll keep it short, but particularly just around technology. What would a Jewish Jesus feel, and how would he interact with technology today? What would that look like? The internet, social media, because there's a lot of different people saying a lot of different things, and I think it would be really interesting to hear your perspective from a Jewish context. What is the perspective on technology?
So the rabbis have a saying in the Talmud that it is the responsibility of rabbis to reinterpret the Torah in every generation.
Yes.
So we don't, like I said before, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, but nothing else is. Yeah. So the question is not whether the scriptures are true. The question is, how do we interpret them in a way that speaks to this generation? And I think technology is an amazing way to get the message out. There's all kinds of temptations with technology to build numbers and build an audience, and it's so easy to get wrapped up in our self-worth when it comes to those things. So I think we have to be careful, but I think he would be fully engaged in, I think more in terms of Paul, because I feel like with all the travel Paul did, like even if Paul had airplanes, like where would he be?
Yeah, wow.
And if they had the capacity to just stream from their home, you think about Paul like in prison, and if he had like Facebook Live and he could just go on and preach, how many people would follow him and then unfollow him based on what he says?
Wow.
So, I think technology for us is part of, is an important part of reaching this generation and using it to help people understand the things of God and draw people back to Him.
That's awesome. Love that, Matt.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for being with us. And Matt, just anything final you want to say? And then just tell us where we can find you if people want to connect with you, connect with the book, and so on.
Yeah. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. We have our synagogue has an app. If you look in the App Store under Restoration Seattle, you can find our app with all of our sermons, and Restorations on YouTube and Facebook and all those places. And yeah, I mean, I feel very privileged to be a part of what God is doing in this generation. I feel like we're all birthed for the time we live in. And I feel like I'm a little bit, I don't mean this in a grandiose way, but I feel like the reason why Paul was able to do all the things that he did was because he was both a Torah scholar, raised studying the Torah, but also a Roman citizen.
Yes.
And I think it's cool to be able to, being raised Messianic, but also being an American. And, I obviously love Batman and Iron Man, and I love the culture I live in.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I think it's important for people, specifically Jesus followers, to not hate the culture you live in.
Yeah.
but to love it and embrace the parts that we can embrace. We have to reject certain things.
Sure.
But I think we have to be people who, John Maxwell said it recently, there are too many people that are so focused on cursing the darkness that they never turn on the light. And I think we have to stop cursing the world and instead light up the darkness.
Great wisdom. Well, Matt, thanks so much for being with us today. I think our listeners will have got loads and maybe some great action steps, I think, as well. Because what I love about this whole thing is it's not following Jesus. It's not like one thing. It's an ongoing learning, discipleship, relationship. And I just love that. So I've been so grateful for this, Matt, and hopefully keep learning, growing, and championing context and bringing some of that into the church on this side of the world. So thanks for being with us today. Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Digital Rabbi podcast with yours truly, the fake rabbi. That's me with the actual rabbi over here. Matt, thanks for joining us. And do go follow Matt. I think it's at Rav Matt. And you can follow myself at Satsalaki on Instagram. We'll catch you guys soon. Bye.